Richard Rodriguez. I'm really thrilled to have you with us. It's a great treat. I'm going to introduce him at some length, not appalling length, just at some length, earlier on before his reading. But I just want to say now that, of course, all of you know, because you've read various works of his, that he's the author of, excuse me, 4 books, Hunger of Memory, Days of Obligation, excuse me, Brown, and most recently Darling. And is also a journalist who worked for 20-some years, I think, in the Pacific News Service, and was a regular commentator on the NewsHour, which used to be the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, and is quite an experienced journalist. We'll say more about these things later, but I'm really thrilled to have him because here at AU, I think he so often represents a kind of prose that feels astonishing to me, by which I mean most specifically perhaps his ability to bear down on ideas and to bear down into language, and to uncover in that language, excuse me, things that had not yet even been seen or imagined within words. Brown would be an example. As well as the incredible gorgeousness of that prose. And I think, to me, he's a rarity in that a prose that is often about ideas should be so splendid, and I admire that so much in his work. So let me just introduce and say that this panel, which will begin for about 20-25 minutes asking questions of Mr. Rodriguez, and then we'll open up to everybody, to you, is, in case anyone doesn't know these people, is Rachel Snyder, a nonfiction and fiction writer, excuse me, the author of Fugitive Denim and What We've Lost Is Nothing. Stephanie Grant, novelist, the author of The Passion of Alice and Map of Ireland. And Nolan Perkins Valdez, also novelist, author of The Wench, and Richard in between. So,
Thank you. Thank you to both Richards. I'll take this opportunity to make sure everybody silences their noisemakers. I'm going to start with the first question, and we've been reading Brown in my class or classes and talking about it. And one of the things that was just so remarkable was to observe you holding, 2 opposing ideas in your head at the same time, in so many ways and so many different sets of ideas. And I often encourage my students to be, fiction writers, to be alive to possibilities and things that their characters might do. But it struck me that as a writer, you are alive to paradox to a degree that I just feel like I haven't witnessed before. And I guess I just wanted to ask you to talk about that and to talk about your language and I guess specifically the oxymoron, how many oxymorons are here, the ways you deploy them, and the way that you stay alive, I guess, at the level of language and at the level of intellect to paradox.
I don't have any simple answers to those questions. One is that I grew up, those of you who know that my first book, Hunger of Memory, which had some success because it was politically not of its time. It was a book skeptical about affirmative action and bilingual education and sort of the holy grail of the left. And there are still places in this country I cannot go, colleges that will not invite me ever, because those aging faculty members still have some kind of memory of my political potency. But I grew up in a house without books, and I grew up in a house of secrets. That is, I was living a very intense literary life as a young reader, but I had almost no way of ever talking about it. And I was queer. And so I had obviously a very vivid sexual imagination, which I never described to anybody. And so all of this, this is the making of a writer. You want a normal person, they end up selling houses in Bethesda. If you want this creature of some complexity and shadow, then you might be a writer, the more troubled you are. I guess I started with some sense that I had to shock the reader into paying attention to me. And there is a kind of flamboyance in some of these essays, which both pleases me and sort of embarrasses me sometimes, but they are showy pieces. They're meant to shock, they're meant to surprise, they're meant not to be orthodox. The moment I feel myself moving toward orthodoxy, I just move away from it, because I just feel the reader's boredom in that instance. And that, we were talking about Brown, and I did a piece in Newsweek, which nobody read unless you had a toothache. And you were in a dental office, you might have seen it, but, and certainly the president didn't see it. But I said, the point at which all of you got people going on about our first black president, I said how glorious it was that we had our first brown president. By which I meant that this man who was the nightmare. Am I there? Who was this nightmare for Jim Crow, who had in fact united the races that had been separated by law in this country, now strode across the American landscape and said, I am here. I am the violation that you have feared. But he didn't. He didn't read Newsweek that week. But I deliberately did that, and I went on NPR, and they were going on about the first black president, and I said, no, we have our first brown president, and this ridiculous woman in one of these morning shows, Morning Edition, who listens to those shows unless you're stuck in traffic? But anyway, she said, but no, she said, you don't understand. You don't understand. For America, this is our first black president. I said, well, I come from Hawaii, obviously, because I don't get it. I saw his mother, and she looks whiter than snow to me. Anyway, this is partly theatrical. You understand? But I think language has that possibility to it. It is surprising. It should surprise you. The greatest poems, bang, they surprise you. You didn't know that poem was going to end that way. And it just springs at you in ways you didn't know you were going to cry at the end of that poem. Or that story, that novel. You didn't know that it was going to end that way. The other thing that I try to do with my essays, because I'm interested in the play of ideas, is make the conclusion the least interesting part of the essay. In fact, there are no conclusions. I tantalize you with the idea that right now, in your mind, as you're thinking about getting out of here in a few minutes and what you have to do in an hour, all the way ideas come to you, they come to you within the fabric of your body, of your experience, of your distractions, and that is the drama of our thinking life, you understand? So that I come to a conclusion is almost not the point. I come within the drama of my thinking life to you, and I let you into the way an idea can be colored. Am I okay.
Okay. I have two questions, and I think I only have time for one, and I can't figure out which one I really want the answer to both of them. So I'm going to talk about something that doesn't get talked about in nonfiction all that much at all, which is in nonfiction that is not memoir, which is the craft of nonfiction.
Did you hear that? That in writing departments, nonfiction generally is the orphan daughter, and she's ill attended to. But I believe that we are entering an age with, the French cultural minister, who was in the New York Times this morning, who had gone to lunch with the Nobel Prize winner in Paris 2 days ago, admitted when she came out of their lunch that she hadn't ever read his books. That was one thing. And then she admitted that she hasn't read a book for 2 years. Okay. We are entering an age where people are not reading books. And nonfiction, I think, is going to be more prepared for that age than perhaps fiction will be. But that's the first point.
Yeah, so my question my question actually comes from hunger of memory, and nonfiction is always discussed in terms of content, but not style, not voice, all that kind of stuff. And there was one passage I was sort of looking. I read this over the summer, and then I was just sort of flipping through it again, and there was a passage that just struck me. That feels very, very crafted to me, and it probably is helpful for those of you who have it in Hunger of Memory. It's page 184. It's just the way it's framed. It's so lovely in its energy and its emotion of the moment. Can I just
Yes,
read this little
please.
passage? At the edge of hearing, I listened to every word he spoke, but behind my eyes, my mind reared, spooked and turning, then broke toward a reckless idea. Leave the university. Leave. Immediately, the idea sprang again in my bowels and began to climb. Rent money. I pictured myself having to borrow. Get a job as a waiter somewhere. I had come to depend on the intellectual companionship of students, bright students, to relieve the scholar's loneliness. I remembered the British Museum a year in the silence. I wanted to teach, I wanted to read, I wanted this life. But I had to protest. How? Disqualify myself from the profession as long as affirmative action continued? Romantic exile? But I had to. Yes, I found the horizon again. It was calm. There's something about the precision of the language, and there's a lot going on there. I mean, the punctuation matters if you actually can follow that in while I'm reading it. The verbs, and I actually, this seems to me, unless you're God, and you might be God, but this seems to me a passage that only emerges from deep, deep, deep revision and from rewriting, and that is a really complicated way to ask you to talk a little bit about the craft of revision in your work.
The first thing I have to say is that I don't recognize those words. They are far enough, now, I mean that seriously, they're far enough into my past that I almost don't remember having written them.
You're like, I'm so good.
No, they're pretty good. But I want to tell you something. I think you're capable right now of a prose that I'm not capable of. I cannot write that way. I don't know how to do that anymore. My prose is not arthritic, but it is of a different sort now. And that clarity, that poetic burst in that prose is just, it's quite glorious. I'm not speaking of myself, I'm speaking of that author. I want you to be attentive to the watch that you're wearing or the clock on the wall, that time passes and there are things that you cannot postpone. If there is a story or something on you right now, you better attend to it. Because you're not going to be able to write it again in 5 years. You're going to write something quite different. I'm writing prose right now that I think is more daring, more challenging, and more playful than that young man's prose. But he wrote prose of an elegance that I can't even imagine writing anymore. Every season of your life has different literary possibilities, okay? Now, the necessity of rewriting is that you get a prose that is that polished. The problem of rewriting is that you end up writing out what you did on Tuesday because you're here on Thursday. And Thursday rules over Tuesday. And sometimes Tuesday knew things. And you have to be really careful with rewriting. You have to give yourself and your different voices and your different time zones a capacity to keep breathing. And I'm not arguing against revision. I'm just telling you, just realize that you're revising yourself. And when you scratch it out, before you completely exit out, you should look at that line again and wonder, what was it that I was trying to do there? And why didn't it work there? And what do I know now that I didn't know then? That process of the self-analyzing the self is a very complicated one. And if you have a manuscript, I know people, the bravery of lives, people who've had books rejected, manuscripts rejected, they put them in a drawer somewhere, and they pull them out in 10 years and revise. And I keep saying, but you're not revising, you're writing a new novel. You're in a different season. It's not the same, you know? So realize that with all the necessity for revision, the scrubbing, the washing, the erasing, with all of that when you sit at your computer and you press delete, know what you're doing, because sometimes really good sentences are dying because Thursday says to Tuesday, no, I know better now. And you look at the photographs of yourself as a teenager and you think, what did I ever think? How could I wear that hairdo, you know? Or the woman at 30 who says, what did I see in that jerk? How could I marry him? We were both 20 years old. He's a jerk. Well, 20 knows something sometimes that 30 doesn't know. And it doesn't work in any simple linear way. Maybe that bouffant hairdo was the closest you'll ever come to your real gaudy soul, you know? And this later revision that you turn into a nun in later years, maybe that isn't as real as that 20-year-old was. You understand what I'm saying? But be careful of tattoos.
Thank you. That was actually, can you hear me? Really helpful to me. I'm in the process of revising a manuscript and wary of erasing myself with my editor's comments. Speaking of the self, I wanted to know, one of the things Richard and I were talking about with Darling is the masterful way you move back and forth between your personal experiences and your philosophies, your ideas about the church, your ideas about race, about gender. What is the relationship between the I of your essays and the I of Richard Rodriguez? Like your public and your private, how do you manage your public and private selves as an essayist?
I guess the first thing I want to say about your first intuition, and that is that I would never write a memoir. I'd never write simply about the I moving his way through life. I always would write about an issue. For example, when I wrote about being a young man in Los Angeles in the 1970s and 80s, I wrote about AIDS. AIDS let me write that essay. It wasn't the other way around. I didn't start writing and then AIDS walked into the room. It was that AIDS allowed me to talk about that time in Los Angeles, those dinner parties I used to go to. I'm going to read an essay tonight that was in the New York Times last week about being in a car with Paul Monette. You know who Paul Monette was? He was a memoirist, yes. And he, in a crowded little car on a winter day when all the windows were steamed up. And there were 6 people in that car that day, and they're all dead, with one exception, me. But I wouldn't have written about the I in that instance if they were not there. The they allowed me to write about the I. So that it was within, this is a journalist in us, I think. We almost by instinct, are always looking out for what you're doing. And then how that plays on us is what interests us. Whether we're different from you, whether we're acting in the same way, whether your behavior reminds us of ourselves, whatever that is, that interplay of the I and the they is for me crucial to the essays, the literary essays that I try to write. I am not writing about me. I'm writing about this interplay between that woman here and me. And this distance is the literary possibility of our relationship. I couldn't write about either her situation there or my situation here. I've done those pieces in newspapers writing about her, but I've never, in literary essays, I write about us, the drama of our relationship. In other words, she's I don't mean to embarrass you, but she's a genius. She's won a MacArthur Award or something, okay? And I'm really interested in what genius looks like or what it smells like. We were just talking about W.H. Auden. And the first time I ever met W.H. Auden at Oxford, he had a stench to his body that was really quite remarkable. It was from too much drinking. It was just, his body was wasting away. And I smelled it. I've smelled death. I know what that smells like. It was something like that. And I recoiled from it. And his poetry is the most elegant, the most beautiful poetry imaginable. If you don't read Auden before you get out of this penal institution, then you will really be the incarcerated fool, because both his essays and his poems are just glorious. But he also had a stench. And it seems to me one of the values of having a writer come to talk to you once in a while is that we have bad teeth, or that I live in London part of the year, and all of us in London, we wear these socks like this. Even Prince Harry, and he wears socks like this. He'll wear these really expensive Savile Row suits, but look at his socks. They'll be these socks, okay? You should notice, what are they doing out there? You should notice eccentricities of that sort, okay? Because writers exist. We scratch. We have itches, and we're not always admirable. We're sometimes, the cost of the writing life on our bodies is sometimes enormous. And, I know movie stars late in their career in Hollywood who were devastated by the loss of their beauty. But I also know writers who lost the juice. Whatever that was, it fled from them at some point. They wrote one great story. They wrote one great novel. They wrote one great screenplay, and it never happened. It seemed the world wasn't interested in them again in that way. Look at what they look like. That this is a physical act that we do when we write. You understand? And we exist within our bodies. We are bodies as we write. Never forget that. And never forget how shabby we sometimes are, even when we produce the most elegant prose and poetry in the language. Is that what you asked me?
Yeah, so you're basically saying this isn't really you here tonight. This is someone else.
Well, you know that wonderful Borges essay, Borges and I, do you know the essay? Yeah. This is Luis Borges in Buenos Aires, an old man, a genteel old man, a racist of some magnitude when he speaks of the lost Indians of Argentina, compares them basically to animals. He writes this essay about how everyone comes to see Borges, but no one comes to see me. And the graduate students all come, and the professors all have questions for Borges, but no one asks me anything. And it goes on and on. Borges, has written some wonderful sentences, but I've written some wonderful sentences, and no one's ever published me. And at the end of the essay, he writes, I do not know which of us has written these words. It's really spooky that. When I say I don't recognize him, I haven't reread that book since I wrote it. And partly the difficulty with rereading is that sometimes I see, a lot of writers will say, I don't like to reread my work because I'll see mistakes. But many times I don't reread my work because I see how good they were. And you're old enough now to have experience of finding work that you might have written in high school, and you think, my God, where did that come from? Where did she come from? Who was she? And I remember she just wrote that off one night. The paper was due the next day, and she wrote that. And now I spend a whole semester writing my fucking 10-page paper, and it won't come. It won't come. All of the superstitions that attach to writing have to do with the sense of the writer as being, in some sense, if not a victim, certainly the passive agent, that the energies come from without. So the writer ends up talking about the muse. The muse came to me. Today I was able to write that sentence. Yesterday I couldn't write it. Or yesterday I wrote it and today nothing came. And so the only thing I did is I just waited for it to happen. Or the graces, or inspiration, or the Spirit. But we know, those of us who write every day, that it is never the same. That some days it happens, and some days it doesn't happen, and the relationship of those 2 days is a mystery to me. Does it happen because I endured the purgatory of yesterday, or does it happen because I'm impatient with the purgatory of yesterday? How does that work, the silence and the voice? How does it ever work, You're going to have to get to know yourself if you want to write. You're going to have to get to have some sense of the rhythm of your internal life. I know because I used to teach you. When I was at Berkeley, I had a writing class for one semester. It was at the end of my teaching career. And there were some of you in that class who were as good as any writer I've ever read or met. And I try to flatter you. I try to say to you that you have something going in there. You better attend to it, because if you don't attend to it, it's going to turn like cancer into you. And you're going to end up like this. You're going to end up like this, maybe making a lot of money and living in Scarsdale, but you're going to end up like this. It's going to turn against you, that energy. I promise you, if you don't have a way to sing it, or dance it, or paint it, or rhyme it, it's going to turn against you. And I had 2 students who were the best. And they didn't write. They're silent. I don't know what they're doing. I have no idea what they're doing. But I'm telling you, if you don't attend to your grace, it'll turn against you. It may take 10 years, it may take 20 years, but it will turn with a ferocity. Does anybody know who Tilly Olsen is? Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful Tilly Olsen. I knew her toward the end of her life. You did too. But she wrote, as a young woman, some short stories, and Tell Me a Riddle. Do you know the collection? Extraordinary collection. She was, you realize, I remember when I first read D.H. Lawrence, The Coal Miner's Son, and realized that most of the writers I had read in English literature were middle-class people. I'd never read anything like this. This is a coal miner's son, and he knows things, like he knows the weight of a body. When you carry a body into a house, he knows what the body does in the coffin. Virginia Woolf didn't talk about that. It's just a different layer of experience that he's attaching. Well, in some way, Tell Me a Riddle. There's a story. I Stand Here Ironing is the title of the short story, where you realize how few women writers stand here ironing, talking about their daughter. Everything that you are has to be useful for your art. And if you are a mother, if you're taking care of your mother, if you are the son or daughter of an alcoholic, if you are an alcoholic, everything pertains. I stand here ironing, and the teacher has asked her to come in to talk about your daughter. I can recite parts of that short story from memory. But what happened to Tilly Olsen is she married a Jack Olsen. Was that his name? Yeah, Jack Olsen. He was a stevedore, and I used to run under the Golden Gate Bridge. There's a bench to his honor, which the family has donated right under the Golden Gate Bridge, where I saw a woman jump off, and she almost hit me one day. Jack Olsen. Well, at the end of her, toward the end of her life, the children go away. The four children, and Mom, I gotta go. I gotta be me now. Okay. So they go away, and she suddenly, the real world says, okay, pick up your pen, start writing again. Gone.
And those stories that became our great gift, this very thin collection, were written in a pretty short period of time.
Yeah.
It's been a few years. And then things changed for her again.
I just turned 70, and everything makes me cry. Babies make me cry. Telling the story of Tilly Olsen makes me cry. Everything is sad, but also, it's beautiful tears. I mean, everything is just so touching to me. That a woman who can't find that voice again as an older woman there's a story that I don't know whether it's true, but Toni Morrison. A story told about Toni Morrison. She had one of her sons was doing his imitation of an orangutan around her neck one day, and do you know the story, any of you? And he coughed. He was trying to get her to, yeah, honey, I'm that sort of thing. Yeah, honey, and he was like this, Mom, and then he coughed up orange juice on her piece of paper, and it was a puddle of orange, and she found herself writing around it. That is something. That is really
I have
something.
another funny Toni Morrison story. She was giving a reading at a university in New York, and this goes to your point. And they were in this old church, and there was a bat have you heard this story?
No.
Flying around the rafters, and it was started to swoop down, and the crowd went woo, and then it swooped down again, and the crowd went woo, and she's still reading, and she stops and says, "If it bites me, I'm gonna sue." And then she kept reading for another hour. She read. This is the story that she never stopped. And then when it was over, she said thank you, and the bat was still there. So it goes to the sort of seriousness of the task here.
Yeah. You know, I'm very depressed as a journalist at the death of American newspapers. I'm really depressed as the one thing I said before I came here just an hour ago to those people who were organizing my visit and this hour is that I want to be of help to you because I have no vanity at this point. There's nothing I want to do. I don't want to gain your affection. I'm here to help you. But one of the things I know is that you live in a very different age than I do. I've just come from the Middle East. I've been spending time in the Middle East. And the Abrahamic religions are religions of the book. And I have been in Saudi Arabia watching at Sharia schools kids memorizing the Quran, making it almost tattooed on their bodies. I've seen Jews dancing with the Torah. I've seen Christians, saw this old Orthodox monk pull out this 7th century Bible and kiss it with a devotion that an old man would give his dying wife. And I come to America, and of course, everything is Kindle, or it doesn't exist. We don't read anymore. We don't do much of anything except scratch and like, don't like, friend, no friend. And I wonder what your world is. How are you going to be writers? When I was your age, I was writing for the Los Angeles Times, and there was money in it. I took Barbra Streisand out to lunch and interviewed her, and there was money in it. Now, there's nothing. You understand? I work in England for the BBC, but there's not a lot of money in that. But it's a real task to be a writer in an age that doesn't read. And that perplexion is one that I cannot help you with. You're going to have to help me. You're going to have to tell me what it is to be a writer in an age that doesn't read. Are we all going to turn into, what's her name, Lena Dunham? Or what's her name? Are we going to take off our clothes on HBO and sell our memoir? Is that the way it's going to work? I think at some later age, there's going to be a carnival wagon coming by with tambourines, and I'll say, what's all that noise? And they'll say, oh, the writers are in town.
Maybe that's a good place for you to open this up on that wondering. Jill,
Yes.
your question.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It's going to sound like you have to be gay to be a writer, but I don't want you to say. I don't intend to say that. But
No, that's fine.
But I do think one of the things that I learned very carefully was irony, because I would be very careful about how I spoke about someone. If I met a young man and my sister asked him, was he good looking? I would say, oh, I didn't notice, there was always, language always had that kind of layered quality to it. But one of the things I began to develop quite early in my life was almost a war against words. Nothing satisfied me. And that when I heard myself called Hispanic, for example, I just have a writerly disinclination to accept that term. I don't know what it means. I mean, for one thing, I'd look more Indian, New World Indian, than I'd look like someone walking down a boulevard in Madrid. And so there was something about the word, this is not a political thing, this was just linguistic. It didn't seem to work for me. When I heard people talking about themselves as being gay during the AIDS years, and there was nothing gay about those years. Charlie Rose once asked whether I was a gay writer, and I said, no, I'm a morose writer. At some level, part of our energy has to be in the play with which we respond to the dullness of language around us. Everything is uninteresting. I mean, I'm sitting there in a barber's chair watching Oprah Winfrey. I can't get out of that damn chair. And there is Oprah with Bono, and they're talking about being green and how it's important for us to be green, like nature. And then they get on their private planes and go somewhere else to be green. And I think to myself, I wonder whether any of them have ever looked out an airplane to notice that most of the world is brown, sand, mud, and that the desert, by the way, is the fastest growing ecology right now in the world. It is swallowing the great cities of China as we speak. But even in places where nature is green in the spring and the summer, nature reaches her fullness in the brownness of autumn and winter. And then it occurred to me that maybe this green business, in my hotel where I'm staying, if I allow the maid not to make the beds, change the sheets, I'm being green. Maybe this green thing is really about death. Maybe it's that we don't want to think about the brownness of winter, and that we can only identify with the spring tree, with the young lovers under the spring tree. You should, at some level, always play or question or feel, uneasy with these labels they're giving you. Are you a feminist? Are you queer? Are you old? Are you a student? Are you an American? Are you a poet? At some level, there should be something in you that begins to press against the noun and to feel the confinement of that as much as the possibility of that. And that I urge on you as the basis for the dialectic that you're describing, just to play with what society, at some level, we're at war with our own language. We are given these words of this glorious language we call English, but it's really a language more accurately described as American. This American tongue, which has so many languages within it. We're given this language, and yet if we are real poets, what we find is we have to invent words, because those words aren't good enough. Or we have to explode words, because those words seem too confining. Or we have to rhyme words into oblivion, because we want to master the words that master us. You understand what I'm saying? At that level, although we are wordsmiths, we are also at war with language. And you mustn't be shy about that. Are you happy, your wife says to you. And you snap at her and say, what a stupid question, am I happy? But that's the answer we should give. What a stupid thing to ask me. Am I happy? Am I gay? I was telling Richard about a young man I knew who was very beautiful and lost both his legs at the end of his life, had AIDS. The last thing he said to me, he was in my arms. He said, people used to think I was beautiful. And then he died. Am I gay? That's a good one. Yeah. Something else. Shyness does not become you. Not at this age. Not at this age. You can be shy when you're my age, yes. That's all good. Yeah, that's all brownness. Brownness is everything. Brownness is feeling at once that I'm part of many things in the impurity of my being, that I'm related to the Indian and to the Spaniard, and that he may have raped her, or she may have seduced him, but I belong to both, and I'm truly, in that sense, I'm brown. But I'm neither Indian nor am I Spaniard, because I belong to a new thing. I am the brown child. You understand? There was in Latin America in the 18th century, there was an artistic tradition called las castas, where they would have father and mother of different color, different races, and the baby between them. Behind there were palms or parrots or pineapples to suggest that this was the new world. America didn't know anything about this. America was a black and white society. And they had names for this child. And the child did not look like the parents. The child was something new. So the child was both and neither, and everything that you're suggesting within the brown perplex. You know, I don't know whether I said in brown. I was in Georgia once, Atlanta, Georgia. I was giving a speech, and a woman came up to me, this African-American woman, and she said, "Do you know what I am?" I mean, that's an impossible question. Do I know what she is? No, I said, "What are you?" She says, "I'm African Korean." And I said, "That's nice." And she said, "You know, my Korean relatives say I'm too black, and my black relatives say I'm too Asian. So I end up in the middle." I thought, that is nice, being in the middle. I said, you know, that superhighway is where a lot of us are going to be in this society. And then she says to me, "But that's not the best part." And then I thought, oh, she's going to tell me she's lesbian. She says, "I'm a Baptist Buddhist." And I thought to myself, I've never met a Baptist. I've met a Richard Gere Buddhist, but I've never met a Baptist Buddhist. Baptist Buddhist is really interesting. I once told a Lutheran minister, a friend of mine, that I'd met a Baptist Buddhist in Atlanta. He said, "That's impossible. It's a contradiction. You can't be a Baptist Buddhist." I said, "But she walks." There are so many contradictions walking around these days, and I salute them. So yes to all of your questions. Yes. I think the navigation is constant because I don't think I feel authentic in any clubhouse right now. I'm in Mexico City. I've done film documentaries in Mexico, and I'm not Mexican. And the people who tell me that usually are the white Mexicans. Of the upper class. I'm not gay enough. At my gym, I don't have a tattoo on my body. I have mixed metaphors in my body. My arms are hugely developed. There's a website called Muslim Muscle, which I recommend to all of you. It is the most extraordinary thing. These Muslims from the Middle East mainly, not from North Africa. But I've never seen bodybuilders like this. And they're always in each other's company. They're even at the Kaaba, the holiest spot in Mecca. They're kissing. These are men who should not be called gay. They would kill me if I ever suggested such a thing. And yet, whatever the sexual anxiety of their sexual being is, since it's not genital, it creates these distortions in their bodies that are uncanny. They have arms that you have the size of which, this is not Arnold Schwarzenegger. These are arms so out of proportion to their bodies that they seem almost pasted on. And everything except the genitals has this quality of the comic book about it. That it is really shocking to see what I'm going to say it plainly, what an incomplete body looks like. A body that is in some way, I would say this of an overdeveloped intellect also, that doesn't attend to the fact that it's in a body. But when you don't exist as a totality. I guess what I never felt that I was good enough for almost any club, and that became almost a freedom. On the night, junior prom night, it was actually senior prom, whatever they call that. I knew I didn't have a teenage life because I wasn't dating. My brother was dating all the time. I had several jobs, and I spent a lot of time reading. And I think it was an April night. They had their junior prom or senior prom, and they were all at some big hotel. And I spared some girl the 3 hours of our dancing together with a carnation corsage, and it happened that night Malcolm X was in Sacramento, and I knew Malcolm. I knew his work. I knew his anger. This was pre-autobiography. I'd seen him on television, and I knew I was interested in him. This was not Martin Luther King Jr. This was something else. This was the North speaking. This was Chicago. This was Omaha. So I took the bus. I didn't tell my mother. Oh, what was I going to say? I was going to listen to Malcolm X tonight. I told her I was going to a movie. Beautiful spring night in Sacramento. I got on the bus and found myself on the south side of town at a social hall of some kind. And there were only blacks, and there were only males. And I went up the steps. See, I'm going to start crying. I went up the steps, and there were these two big black men. They looked like Sonny Liston and Mike Tyson. Big guys in black suits and white shirts. I didn't know. I guess I looked in the room, and I could tell that there was nobody like me there. And I hesitated. And I could tell these two guys were looking at me and hesitating too. Their computation, what do we do with the Mexican kid, and they let me in. The next day, the next Monday at school, I told no one. There was no one to tell that I'd gone to see Malcolm X while they were all dancing to Frankie Avalon. I guess it's that sense that I had no country. That was my freedom. I don't know how else to say it. It was always my freedom. And now, I travel with more than one passport because in traveling in the Middle East, I'd use my Mexican passport more easily than my American passport for all kinds of reasons, none of them interesting. But I like the fact that I have several passports.
We should take a break and give you a moment before reading. Okay. Richard, thank you very much. Hi, I'm Richard McCann, the co-director of the MFA program's Visiting Writers Series, along with the novelist Stephanie Grant, who's sitting over there so as to identify her. And it's my pleasure to introduce essayist, journalist, and memoirist Richard Rodriguez, who's here with us today. And even just saying I'm pleased to introduce, it's my pleasure, is really quite an understatement because actually I'm really thrilled to introduce him and really thrilled that he's here at American University. He is, for me, one of those prose writers whose work is so fine. Emily Dickinson's famous for that line about, I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, but not a fairer house than Richard Rodriguez's prose, I think, one of those prose writers whose work is so fine that I feel like when I'm reading it, I'm sort of rendered simultaneously mute
and yet made more eager to work, on my own stuff. And so my pleasure and my amazement in that work is extravagant. I'm also thrilled to be introducing Richard Rodriguez at American University for a second time, the first having been when I invited him here almost 20 years ago, excuse me, not too long after the publication of his second book, Days of Obligation, An Argument with My Mexican Father, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And as it happens, I don't know where I left that book of mine. Oh, yeah, thanks. This is not a trick where the audience gets involved in a certain way. You're asked to undress, just simply stepping out. Last night, I was looking through his books, and I found the book that he had signed, Days of Obligation, back then, and I was startled because he wrote the date, which was April 1st, 1996. And I wasn't startled because I thought, oh, it's April Fool's Day, he never came, or, it's something like that. I was startled because I realized, I knew that it was in the proximity, but if I can speak personally for just a moment in order to make a larger point, I realized when I saw that date that when he had come here the first time that I was just a month away from the liver transplant that I'd been waiting for a year and a half. And what I realized, of course, then was, even though that you were very kind to me, that I must have looked like a yellow school bus, and that I can't, I don't even want you to tell me if I was like aphasia or something like that, as I was beforehand. But, for me, that was a period of my life in which I was, as a result of end-stage liver disease, in which I was pretty rapidly losing language. I had encephalopathy. My skin was startled cashiers, whom I seldom saw because I often fell over when I was walking. It was a very difficult point. And what's odd is that when I think about April 1st, 1996, is that I actually don't remember it in that context whatsoever. I remember it as this incredibly golden day, and not jaundicey golden, golden. And what I really remember was, being with a writer whose intellect and imagination, whose habit of bearing down hard on words as if to press them into their not yet realized meanings, and his intensity and his Catholic seriousness and his habit of breaking into sudden full laughter, all things that one finds in his prose, that in fact what I remember is feeling incredibly enlivened, even in that circumstance, by the work and by the presence of Richard Rodriguez. So that, in fact, instead of thinking of what I actually probably was, which was stumbling down a sidewalk, what I remember is feeling that I was actually toppling over the cliff of something new, into ideas and feelings and bits of language that one hadn't put together in any original combination before. I remember feeling really awakened. I remember following him down some street in Georgetown, and I think I was chattering away endlessly. Could it be otherwise? Because all of a sudden, it seemed there was so much to say, and that was from being in the presence of the writer of this work. I so admired, so I don't mean to say like it was a miracle and, you're ready for canonization, but something like that. A few biographical words, excuse me. Richard Rodriguez was born in San Francisco to Mexican immigrant parents, and he grew up in Sacramento in a home where only Spanish was spoken. When he entered a parochial elementary school, he possessed, by his own count, in an interview I read somewhere or another, only about 50 random English words. Those of you who've read Hunger of Memory, The Education of Richard Rodriguez, know that his struggles, excuse me, to learn English and to assimilate into American society are the bases for that book, a 1982 book that's still controversial today, I think, because of Rodriguez's strong, I think, wariness would be the mildest word I could use, wariness toward bilingual education and toward affirmative action. Since then, he's published Days of Obligation, excuse me, An Argument with My Mexican Father, the book I mentioned, a series of personal essays that, I guess, meditate upon the cultural gap that divides Protestant America and Americanism from Catholic Mexico. He has published the book Brown, which many of you read, a very beautiful and rich and extended meditation upon the experience and meanings of brown and of brownness. This book was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. And most recently, something many of you have also read, also Darling, a spiritual autobiography, of which Pico Iyer has written in the New York Review of Books. Over 30 years, Rodriguez has maintained a fierce, rigorous, ironic, and sincere cross-examination of both contemporary America and himself. His refusal to settle for easy answers, for fixed assumptions, is what makes Rodriguez so essential. In addition to these books, Richard Rodriguez has published essays in such magazines as Harper's, where he served as a contributing editor, and in which a portion of Darling initially appeared, the American Scholar, Time, the New Republic, the Wilson Quarterly, and the Los Angeles Times Magazine. He's also a journalist who worked for more than 20 years for Pacific News Service and who was a longtime frequent commentator on the PBS NewsHour, for which his video essays on American life, it was so great to watch, for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer earned him a prestigious George Peabody Award in 1997. Stephanie and I have been talking about his upcoming visit for some weeks now, and what seems to be something we would prize about it. And I think one of the things we found ourselves coming back to is that here is a writer who, in an age of pundits, as we often regard this age to be, who is still very much a rare writer, who's still in a sort of lineage of what it means to be a public intellectual, and that lineage that one might think of as, say, Lionel Trilling or Alfred Kazin or Susan Sontag, And this too seems to me sort of an amazing aspect of his work, to have someone still embodying that role and with such seriousness and in relation to both contemporary issues of American culture, but also in relationship to American identity and private identity and all sorts of things. There's much to learn from Rodriguez's work, beginning with the ways in which he explores, but does not attempt necessarily to resolve what he regards as valuable paradoxes, such as those as being between being gay and Roman Catholic, for instance, or being brown in a country, this one that's obsessed with seeing in bifurcations and polarities, such as the polarity between black and white, not without brown. In all of his books, it seems his job as a writer is to never accept standard narratives or orthodoxies. It seems that his job is never to reduce, but always to complicate and complicate and complicate, and to do so that a prose that's as beautiful as it is startling, with sort of taut and yet at the same time luscious syntax, with its rapidly shifting moods and its shifting dictions, from the sober to the comic and the ironic, from plain speech to the dizzying dramatic musicality of the Roman Catholic Mass. I love the way in which he conceives of the essay as the biography of an idea, as he has said, and the way in which he regards the essay as a form in which, as he's also said, everything is admissible. Elvis Presley, Mohammed, Tina Turner, St. Augustine. How, I wonder, as I read him, can a prose be so full and alive as his, and to be filled with so much humor and sorrow and reverie, so that it's ultimately commensurate with the size of life itself. So please welcome Richard Rodriguez.
Thank you, Richard. I do feel like I'm dead. I'm at my own memorial service, and you people have all come, not because of me, but because of Jim, my partner. Everybody loves me, and everybody loves Jim. And for Jim, they've come to my memorial, and Richard has just given this speech, and all of you are wondering, I wonder whether there is food as part of all of this, and how long will this go on? And we haven't heard from my relatives yet. They have to be attended to. I've just reached the age of 70, and one of the things that happens to you when you reach the age of 70, some things don't happen to you that you expect to happen to you. Like, I still lift weights and run down the street at 4:30 in the morning to get into my car to go to the gym. I'm a mixed metaphor at the very least, but is that that you don't apologize as much as you used to. And I don't know what that is, but I find myself in the habit of I would begin with an apology. The apology would go something like this, that I'm not a real writer, I'm an essayist. And that I was thinking today, walking around Washington, the number of times I've been in the city, except for Richard, except for this university, the only times, I don't think I've ever been invited to the city as a writer. I've never been invited to read, which is something I don't know how to do, which is my second apology. But, I've gone to poetry readings, and the poet gets up there, and he's good or not good, and the audience somehow in this day and age can listen to poetry, which I find that gift of the audience to listen to a writer's work to be so gracious. There is no trick to being a writer. The trick is to having readers, because the reader completes the writing process. And when writers exist, it's because you exist as the listener. I also say to young writing students that if you want to be a writer, learn to be a reader. Because one of the things that reading does for you, it increases the possibilities of, and I say this in a quite simple way of imitation, the possibilities of oh, I didn't know I could do that. I didn't know I could write that way. I remember in reading, this is in high school, D.H. Lawrence, Sons and Lovers, the novel that I love most of all. I love so much in Lawrence and admire so much of his bravery, but the short stories certainly. But in that novel, there is this scene in a paragraph of this fight between Paul Mellers, his mother and his father. The mother's a school teacher, the father is a coal miner. And already in that dialectic is the drama of the young boy's life. The sickly boy who will never be his father's son as much as his mother's son. But they have quarreled, and it is in the Midlands of England, and it is in early spring or late winter. And this happens in a paragraph, that she goes to the garden. I think he might have hit her, or slapped her, or equally with words slapped her. And she goes into the garden, and she's weeping. And in a paragraph, Lawrence is able to describe how her weeping at the loss of this man who she loved, this beautiful male beast that she loved, has turned into a bitter, balding man that hits her. She begins to breathe in the flowers in the garden at the same time that she's weeping out her tears. And there is simultaneously the marriage and the divorce in the act of weeping in the garden. And this dark garden, which is suddenly latent with possibility of spring, becomes the match for this dark garden, which is also the scene of her deepest winter. I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know I was in high school. I didn't know a writer could do a paragraph that is that compact and that varied in its possibility. So one of the things I urge on you is not only to come to readings, for which I thank you, although I'm not going to do much of a reading tonight, but one of the things I want you to do is to learn how to read other people's work in order to deepen your own. Many times I meet young writers and I say, well, have you read her or have you read him? And they haven't. And they're large names. They're very large names, and you should know their work. You should know something of them, that they were around, that they were your age, that they lived in bodies like you, and they managed to do something that is remarkable. You should know it as a competitor, as you who fight against their greatness, but also as an apostle or as a witness to their greatness. I don't apologize. I'm not going to read, but I am going to read. I'm not going to read from any of my books. I'm going to read from a piece I did in the New York Times last weekend or sometime. I don't know, because it appeared online the week before it appeared in print. And so my niece who works for Facebook sent me a notice that she read it, and she says, I have Twitter to thank for it. I, who rage at Christmas dinners against all of that. One of the things about being an essayist that I find convenient to being 70, although I notice in the blurbs, which are reprinted to some degree in Darling, is the number of times critics would say, oh, he's a very great writer, or he may be our greatest essayist alive today, or he may be the finest essay writing in the English language. They'll always say, but this is possibly his last book because he publishes every 10 years, and we will never hear of this guy again. So don't worry if you miss it this time. There ain't going to be another time. So I'm reminded of death with each one of these praises, but one of the things I want to say about growing old is that, there are some things that I can't do that you can do. I can't outrace you, I can't outlove you, but I can write essays of some density. And that is because I think the essay incorporates the whole of experience, the variety of experience in some special way. I know the essays that I'm writing now have to them a kind of density of illusion, of narrative from many, many years. And my advantage over you of being 70 is that I have met people. I have met more people than you have. That's my advantage. And someday you will stand at 70 and you will say, that's my advantage as a writer. I knew Orson Welles. The first time I met Orson Welles was on the Merv Griffin show. Do you know the Merv Griffin show? No. Yes? Some of you? I was on the Merv Griffin show with my first book, Hunger of Memory, and Orson Welles was on. And I think that Citizen Kane is one, if not the greatest, is pretty close to the greatest American film ever made. And Orson Welles was he was enormous. He was about 3 years away from his death. And he was doing what he'd always done in his life. He was doing magic tricks with Merv Griffin. And I was at the very end. It was sort of, I came off after a tenor from the Metropolitan Opera. I was the last guest of the party. There's nothing more irrelevant than being the last guest of the party. But Orson Welles has some relationship to Mexico. He married a Mexican. He's had some great lovers, film stars from Mexico. He made a movie in Mexico. He has some relationship to Mexico that is complicated. And of course, he loves Spain. Spent much of his life in Spain. And Merv Griffin, who didn't read the book, made some allusion to the difficulty of Richard Rodriguez leaving his family life and the journey. I think he specified that it was a Mexican-American family or something to that degree. How painful it was for him to go to school, to go away from the family, to learn more than his father. The great sin of the Mexican house is when you begin to dismember the house by learning too much, by reading too much. And Orson Welles said from the other end of the sofa, boy, I'm glad you wrote that book. And I thought, well, my God, I'm glad Orson Welles is here tonight because nobody else would have said. The tenor from the Metropolitan Opera was not going to say that. And Merv Griffin wasn't going to say it either. Later, when we had first parked, this was at a studio on Hollywood Boulevard. There's a big parking lot in back. And when the publicist had driven me there, in the parking lot, there were almost no cars. This was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. When we went back out to the parking lot, the parking lot was filled with barriers and thousands of people because there was going to be a second taping of the entire cast of Falcon Crest. Do you know what that was? Some of you might, Falcon Crest. So there were thousands of people. And my publicist who was walking alongside of me. We were behind Orson Welles, who was about 20 feet ahead of me. Somebody from the Merv Griffin show came up and handed me Hunger of Memory because they'd had no use for it. No one would read it. And so I took it and thanked him. And then she said, give it to Orson Welles. To thank him for saying that today. So I went up, there he was. And I went up to him and I said, Mr. Welles, it would be such a pleasure and privilege for me to have you read this book sometime, or at least to have it. And he said in a very courtly way, it'd be a privilege and pleasure for me to have it. And I will read it. And we walked a little bit side by side. And I didn't want to gush, and I didn't want to say all that he had meant to me when he was a young man in Hollywood, this brilliant star in the sky. And all of a sudden, from behind the barrier over there, I heard this guy go, you, he kept on saying. And I looked over, and Orson Welles was right here. I looked over, and I said, Orson? He said, no, you. So I walked over to him, and he handed me a pen and a piece of paper. And first I thought he was some kind of legal processor, and I was being given a... He said, I want your autograph. It was the first time anybody has ever asked for my autograph. And I saw Orson Welles over there. I said, that's Orson Welles. That's my Orson Welles story. My Mother Teresa story, which I'm going to tell you. This is the sort of thing that if you're an old man, you have stories. I can bore you to death. I can tell you stories all night. I was with her in San Quentin prison. And she's just a tiny little woman. One of the reasons I quarreled with Christopher Hitchens, a man with whom I'd worked at the BBC some years before, he wrote a hateful little piece. There is something about England that I love. I love London, where we spend about 6 months of the year. But England does produce people like Christopher Hitchens, these public school, and we all know the public school means private school, schoolboys who are not nice. And they're trained to be not nice. And they're allowed to be not nice. Anyway, he did a piece in Vanity Fair magazine, which is, if you've been at a dentist or a barber, you know that as soon as you open it, all the perfume ads fly out. Vanity Fair magazine that is just one step up from People magazine. And the Canadian editor there, who desperately wants to be English, he desperately wants to be English. And if there's an article about Prince Will or the baby to come, please let him know because he'd like to publish it. Anyway, there was an article by Christopher Hitchens about Mother Teresa in which he remarks that she is ugly. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. I know in America we allow ourselves to say some things, but I also know that's not our style, to call an old nun ugly. It would never occur to us to write that. And I wrote against him. At the end of Darling, he makes an appearance, Christopher Hitchens. We're at a literary conference in London, in New York, and he's drunk. And he drops, we're on an elevator together. He does not recognize me, even though he speaks very nicely of me on C-SPAN. You can see it. But I thought, oh God, please do not recognize me tonight. I do not want to talk about your support of the war in Iraq. But he drops, he points to the floor he's going to, and all the papers underneath his arm fall. And we spend the remaining seconds picking up all of his papers from the floor. That ends just before Mother Teresa goes into heaven at the very end of Darling. But my Mother Teresa story is that the day she came to San Quentin prison, Jim, my partner, who is more of a Catholic than I am, does not find this story amazing. But I continue to tell audiences because I find it a source of such comfort that the chapel had been emptied except for some really thuggish men who stood in a row, and they were like schoolboys. They were so nervous. And she came, and she was like at their waist. And these are murderers and robbers and rapists. And in another circumstance, she might have given them rosaries, but of course they would have used those to strangle each other. So she gave them holy cards. And then she told them. This, I think about, and after reading her journals and her letters, which were published without her permission by her confessors and various bishops after her death, the long struggle she had to believe, the absence of God from her life through the 40 years of her life. when she was doing all the work and all the famous people were coming to see her. And she would watch the other nuns in the convent praying, and she felt nothing. And yet she went and was bathing those bodies before their death. She said to those prisoners, she said that if you want to see the face of God, look at the face of the prisoner standing next to you. I'm going to read from the New York Times. I don't know how long any of this takes. You could be here forever because I don't know how to do this. The New York Times has this very strange insert called Tea on Sundays. It's a glossy magazine, and nobody will admit to having read it. But oddly enough, everybody I know saw this essay. They just happened to be looking through it. And what's the wonder of it? Let me tell you something. I'm going to back up. Every one of you have strange interests and strange things that you know that you've never shared with any of us. Maybe because you don't think we'll be interested. Maybe because the context has never presented itself. When I was a boy, I probably knew, in the 1950s, I knew more about professional wrestling than anybody in the world. And I've never written about all of that. I knew professional wrestlers. I knew all kinds of people. But I've never really written about that world that I knew. Professional wrestling comes into various sentences of mine, but it's there. I also knew in the 1960s more about Broadway musicals than most human beings. But you're going to say, well, he's a gay little teenager. What else would he know? But I knew a lot about that music. I thought about Rodgers and Hammerstein, how they sounded, and how different it was from Cole Porter. I knew the lyrics. I studied it and considered it. And when Stephen Sondheim came along 2 decades later, I listened to him. And this is all knowledge, which I don't exactly use, except in one chapter in Brown, at the end of the essay, The Prince and I. But one of the things I've thought about in my life, again, without much consideration to writing about it, is fashion and fashion models. I've thought about beauty probably more than is healthy. What makes a person beautiful? Why beautiful people are unhappy? If on a street in New York, I've walked behind a beautiful man, wondering what kind of attention he gets from pedestrians walking past. And I'm sometimes surprised by the fact that no one looks, and other times by the fact that people are constantly looking, and he doesn't look. Well, the New York Times has a new editor, and she says, "Do you want to write a piece for us?" I said, "But I don't have anything to say. I don't know anything." She said, "You know all about. You went out to lunch with one of our editors and talked about Yves Saint Laurent, the famous French fashion designer. Why don't you write about Yves Saint Laurent?" I said, "But every week you have a piece about Yves Saint Laurent's estate in Morocco, or Bunny Mellon's gardens in Virginia, or some tedious thing. It's never very interesting. Fashion magazines are never about fashion. They're just about vanity." She said, "Well, why don't you write about something that would interest you?" And I said, "Well, I did see a naked man on the street the other day in San Francisco." She said, "Well, write about that." I said, "But this is a fashion magazine. The naked man would be surrounded by ads for Swiss wrist watches and very expensive Italian shoes and so forth. And there would be the naked man. There he is in the New York Times with his wings." This is called, my title for the essay, which was Glittering Angel. Their title is Nakedness in a Digital Age. It is not an unfair title, but you know, one of the little wars that I conduct in San Francisco, which is now surrounded by these tech, there's this guy next door who has an expensive car that he parks on the street that goes 250 miles an hour. And you hear it at the intersection because there's stop signs at every, in this Victorian city we live in. This car just waiting to burst out. And of course he has to go 35 miles an hour. Is this thing that now we are devoted to. And this essay gave me a chance to write about AIDS and about Steve Jobs and about the body. And this is my essay. Walking down Castro Street on a Sunday afternoon, just beyond where Divisadero veers to the right, I saw a naked old man walking toward me. By old, I mean, at 25 paces, he looked to be nearly my age. Should I look away? His torso was trimmer than mine, his legs less sturdy, his hair as thin. The old man looked straight ahead, as beautiful young women learn to do. He was wearing sandals. My curiosity about his nakedness was none of his concern. Public nakedness seems a relic of the last century in San Francisco, now that the city has become the real capital of digital nowhere. A city clamorous with the sounds of breaking and building, a place where a young visionary class is deliriously rewarded for inventing the ways we leave our bodies behind. A rotary of men who gathered for recreational nakedness in a small triangular park on Upper Market Street seemed to have no context. Doubtless, preoccupied Pan was headed to join his confreres in the mini park. The naked men of San Francisco were accustomed to sit on garden chairs, to chat, as men anywhere in the world might take their ease and chat in the sun. But these men insisted on wearing their bodies on city streets. Their bodies were Jeremiah's. Their bodies insisted that this spectacle, not just a spectacle of badgers showing bunt, but of human bodies in plein air, is, after all, only what humans look like, only what humans are, when youth and batteries fail. You will recall that when King Lear takes off his clothes, he offends majesty. The scandal of Lear's abrogation is that without raiment, a king is a frail, poor creature, indistinguishable from a groundling. His kingdom is disarmed. When the Royal Shakespeare Company played in Royce Hall at UCLA, the audience was seated on stage to either side of the playing area. I was as close as King Lear as I am to you. Sir Ian McKellen played Lear. There was no scandal to McKellen's nakedness, only an idiotic reverence on the part of the audience for what Sir was willing to risk for his art. His private parts, likely powdered for the stage, seemed to enjoy the excursion. Regardless of what the old man's head declaimed, "Thou art the thing itself. Unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal as thou art." Supervisor Scott Wiener, who represents San Francisco's District 8, which includes the Castro District, took offense to the naked men on the part of the public taste and initiated a ban on nudity on streets, sidewalks, plazas, and mediums, while permitting nudity at certain beaches and street festivals. On those weekends before the Teddy Bears picnic was declared illegal by City Hall, young men and women passed the naked men by without paying them much mind, as did the general populace of District 8, as far as I could tell. I seemed to be the exception. Had they been nude young men, I would have compelled to check my messages or take another path. One afternoon, I watched as a seminary of teenage girls from Japan came upon the satyrs in their glade. Obligatory shrieks of surprise from the girls, who nevertheless approached the old men. Conversation ensued. Cell phones were raised. Memorial selfies created. San Francisco, 2012. Paul Monette, the writer whom I did not know well, was driving that morning. Cesar, my friend, sat in the front seat. I was wedged between two men in the back seat. One of the two had something to do with Hollywood, something to do with Barbara Eden. Could that be right? Anyway, he begged my pardon for elbowing me as he repositioned himself. The car was small. The windows were steamed. The weather must have been cold or wet. We were driving down to Belmont, now a part of Greater Silicon Valley. at that time a peninsula suburb. Within 10 years, everyone in the car would be dead, except me. The man to my left raised his right arm that had fallen asleep. As he did this, his cuff brushed my cheek. I remembered that day most poignantly as a feel of cashmere. Bodies are real. Once youth passes, we carry our bodies around with a growing sense of estrangement from them, though we fear leaving our bodies behind. Covering our bodies is a lifelong preoccupation, a disguise that represents a revelation. Most people my age have inherited the duty of clearing out the closet of a parent, spouse, lover, or friend. The coats, suits, smell, shine, the stripes, pinks, paisleys, shoes. How can shoes retain the shape of souls? But they do. That afternoon on our return from Belmont, we went to a restaurant on Noe Street. Cesar recited Rimbaud between courses, I recall. I passed the restaurant the other day. It is still a French restaurant. Cesar recounted an adventure he took as a young man in France. On a whim, he drove a red Peugeot from Paris to Kabul. It was April, Cesar said, as if that were explanation enough. Rimbaud traveled 3 continents. He died at 37. During the AIDS years, raised violet lesions, proofs positive of intimacy, betrayed intimacy by betraying the body in public. The marked young man must still make his rounds with downcast eyes, walking with a cane. People looked away. The young man felt himself disappearing from his clothes, from his mirrors, from his eyes. From Rimbaud to Rambo. It became the fashion of some gay men in those years to arm themselves with muscles as much as with condoms. Mr. Clean became an advertisement of health. A delusional gay male fantasy was developed in gyms, modeled on an aesthetic of strength as purity. During the plague years, designers like Calvin Klein and Gianni Versace placed models in their magazine ads who wore nothing or nearly nothing at all. By crossing images of the enviable nude body and the fashionably clothed body, they were equating those two states. Calvin Klein intuited how best to market the equation to the middle class. In an ad for CK underwear, on a billboard over Times Square, Mark Wahlberg, a snarl disfiguring his face, grabbed his own crotch, as in, "Eat my shorts." Wahlberg's pugnacious vulgarity embarrassed the viewer's interest. The torturous message nevertheless sold underpants. Desire to dress as someone who loathes your desire. In 1971, a decade before Wahlberg, Yves Saint Laurent, the most gifted couturier of his generation, had himself photographed nude by Jean-Luc Sieff. Saint Laurent was selling, as it were, his scent, so nudity made some kind of sense. He wore the signature black rimmed glasses by which we recognized him. His body was a fawn's body, his pose a mermaid's pose. His gaze was predatory. His gaze reminds me of the gaze of those blank-faced teenage boys, of the blank-faced teenage boy who locks himself in the bathroom to stand in front of the mirror, to film his naked torso with a cell phone, attempting objectivity by submitting his body to a digital stranger, that stranger himself. Who is the voyeur? I'm looking at a photograph of Sergey Brin, one of the founders of Google Inc. He is strolling down a fashion show runway hand in hand with the designer Diane von Furstenberg. They are both wearing pairs of Google Glass, the marriage of science and fashion. We already live within the 19th century romance of the robotically enhanced body. The United States military outfits warriors for combat with modular integrated communications helmets equipped with night vision scopes. In the eyes of teenage boys, the soldiers resemble comic book superheroes. It must have seemed obvious to engineers in Mountain View if so many people on the planet now walked through their lives holding their cells in front of them like compasses, like divining wands, like seeing-eyed dogs, why not incorporate a computer into the field of vision? A Google Glass, whereby one eye remains connected to the nervous sift of synthetic information, while the other eye, the writer's eye, navigates what do we call it now? Real time? On a Tuesday night, last July 8, 2014, I nearly ran over a young man with red hair at the intersection of 8th Avenue and California Street. The young man was consulting the tiny screen in his hand, oblivious to the red light, as he stepped in front of my car. I screeched and honked, "Jesus!" The young man looked over his shoulder and waved vaguely as he proceeded to the opposite corner. On the other hand, I confess I took my cell phone to dinner one night at a restaurant, thousands of miles from home. I placed the phone where my napkin had been. I am not immune to the horn of loneliness. I am 70 years old. I have questions. On the other hand, I retain an enormous nostalgia for an antique phrase of no currency, the great world. I do not find young people who walk down the street consulting their cell phones to be beautiful. I mean, unless I honk, I find that I'm looking at a city that doesn't look back. The woman, for example, who's forcing gobbets of broken heart into her cell phone, turns her back, refuses my eyes. Am I disappearing from the world? Or is she? I'm a writer in a city where nobody carries a book. I'm a reader who cannot decipher the signs. Graffiti, for example. Digital code, if that is what you call the cascade of numbers and symbols that supposedly underwrites the wealth and knowledge and capability of the planet. Tattoos. I am surrounded in the undressing room by tattoos, brooding skins that demand some sort of attention from strangers' eyes, but are also undecipherable exterior monologues. The body seems to be open for inspection, but is in fact a private diary. It is commonplace to wonder how such tattoos will look 50 years hence. But that's no point, is it? How will your teeth look? How will your toes look? How did Mae West look? As David Beckham's body began to weather, he increasingly presented himself as a fashion model, shark-eyed, revealing to the world sleeves of tattooed fleur du mal that, when zoomed, resembled tombstone art. Turn the pages of the fashion magazine past the Beckham advertisement and you will see the prune-lipped boys of Milan who wear astonishing vacancy. Fall or spring, fashion never ends apparently, unless it ends in an urban park in San Francisco. What we call Silicon Valley is a collection of suburbs connected by El Camino Real, the old Spanish highway of the California missions era. The logic and the allure of the valley's digital superhighway belong to the post-war American suburban impulse against the congestion and the contest of the city. The loneliness social media aspires to repair is the loneliness of empty suburban streets, Dairy Queens, the loneliness of high school, the loneliness of Mexican gardeners, the loneliness of lawns. The advantage of shopping online, Silicon Valley encourages us to believe, is that one need not contend with bodies, with business hours, with complete sentences, LOL. The loneliness social media aspires to repair becomes a loneliness social media creates and exports to the world as connection. The American suburbs created Steve Jobs. Jobs was born in San Francisco, but he grew up in Mountain View, 40 miles to the south of the city. According to his biographer, Walter Isaacson, Jobs was so uncomfortable among the rowdies and bullies at Crittenden Middle School, he told his parents he would drop out of school rather than continue there. Jobs' parents moved their family to Los Altos, a suburb more suburban, a better school, a further remove from complexity. Silicon Valley companies like to describe their corporate headquarters as campuses. Business page surveys routinely list such places as among the happiest places to work in America. Digital think tanks are, in some way, comparable to the Hollywood studios of the 30s, dream factories for the world that were enclaves also. Why would one leave? Silicon Valley is lonely. In recent years, busloads of Silicon Valley engineers have exchanged the complacencies of the suburbs and the adolescence of corporate campus culture for pulse, contest, uncertainty, danger, and commutes on overcrowded freeways every morning and evening. The first time I saw one of them, of course, I'd heard people talk about Google buses. I was having a drink at a cafe on Fillmore Street. A white bus, eerily unbranded, stalled in traffic, completely filling the window of the cafe. There! That's one of them. A man seated at a table in the window pointed toward the bus. All of a sudden, a zombie movie. The destination of the bus, campus location identified only by initials, rippled through a dot matrix upon the blackened window glass. The incongruity, the disproportion of the Trojan thing on a 19th century street of electric tram wires elicited humor from the diners, but also some unease. San Francisco fears colonization by the brilliant, wealthy, youthful suburbs. People in San Francisco say their neighborhoods are losing flavor as rents go up. The city has said it before about gays, Hong Kong millionaires, yuppies. What is more interesting to me than the circumstance that I may not be able to afford this city is the fact that gifted engineers are acknowledging a preference for all the complexities the computer was supposed to save us from. Noise, crowds, lines, panhandlers, red lights, real time. For all its influence on our lives, the culture of Silicon Valley is remarkable for being so uninteresting to look at. I once saw Janis Joplin, dressed in white muslin, looking like Miss Havisham, billowing on a corner in broad daylight. What a vision. Now I pause to regard the young men and women getting off the Google bus. Graduate students in t-shirts, windbreakers, dark jeans, black canvas computer bags slung over their shoulders. Masters of the world, indistinguishable from groundlings. The most influential male fetish of the 20th century originated in San Francisco in the late 19th century, when Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis manufactured and sold overalls and denim pants, punched with copper rivets. Levi's became associated with manual labor, thus with muscle bodies, blacksmiths, stevedores, farmers, then with cowboys, then with schoolboys, cowboy belts, who suffered through the first weeks of September in brand new, stiff, smelly denim, then with James Dean and Sal Mineo, with urban delinquents as much as with the 4-H clubs. Today, jeans are associated with leisure and the triumph of American informality. The pleasure of a pair of Levi's is of a second skin molded to one's body. Europeans pull them up above their navels, which is deplorable usage. Steve Jobs first drew the world's attention as a sparky genius from Cupertino who announced the expanding future is digital. At that time, Jobs often wore a suit and bow tie to interviews and press conferences, and he looked a little bit like Professor Harold Hill. River City's got to have a boys' band. Or because he was rather handsome, like an assistant professor of romantic poetry. As the CEO of Apple, Jobs entertained the idea of uniforms for Apple employees, uniforms of the sort he had seen Sony employees wear in Japan. Apple employees nixed the idea. Jobs eventually chose a uniform for himself, rather priestly, a black turtleneck designed by Issey Miyake, and a pair of faded blue jeans. Traditionally, this was the uniform of the nonconformist, the revolutionary, the bohemian, the poet, the black-clad puppeteer, black so as not to draw attention away from the puppet. Over the years, Jobs repeatedly emerged from his laboratory in his turtleneck sweater persona as Merlin, the magical power behind his own corporate throne. He would drive from Palo Alto to the Macworld convention at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. Jobs walked into the spotlight on a bare stage in front of a giant blue screen that featured a black-lit Apple insignia. In his presentations, Jobs apostrophized his newest project with boyish delight before an audience of stockholders, acolytes, and reporters. He performed a miracle or two of synthesis. The phone is a camera. The camera is a screen. The screen is a book, which the blue screen magnified. At last, he passed the miracle to a waiting world. Apple product rollout assumed a portentousness worthy of a production of Parsifal. Following the Apple playbook, other Silicon Valley and Seattle tech billionaires scheduled merchandising liturgies using similar theatrics: the dressed-down priest, the bare stage, the magnifying screen. Around 2006, the stock market began to notice that Steve Jobs' Levi's were loose on his body. He'd undergone surgery to remove a pancreatic tumor 2 years earlier. In 2009, Jobs had a liver transplant. As Jobs' flesh diminished, so too did Apple products thin. Elegant was the word the media reporters bestowed upon them. At his last keynote address in 2011, Jobs conjured a cloud, postmodern possessive, iCloud. But it was Jobs' body everyone saw, disappearing. The old man on Castro Street was not quite naked. He had applied glitter to his body. Glitter covered his shoulders, his chest, his tabernacle, his backside. He celebrated himself, as will I, this old guy in motion, glittering like a resurrection angel. Thank you. I think I'm supposed to disappear now, but there are two questions people asked in the interval. Can I ask them to myself and sort of conclude this madness by asking myself questions that I cannot answer? One of the questions was, what would I be if I could not be a writer? That's a question that I've asked myself many times. If I didn't have the opportunity to write, I toss it back at you because I think that if you are a writer, if you have that gift, you better attend to it in some way. You better find your audience or manufacture them or create them in some way that I cannot imagine yet in this digital age. But it occurs to me that if you do not become a writer, you will become not only less interesting to yourself, but that skill, as I said to you in the earlier hour, will turn cancerous within you and will not give you peace as you get older. You have to learn the skill of giving out the miracle within you in some way. Even if after the end of a long dry spell, when the words don't come, you only get in front of the stage and do a tap dance for us. You have to give it out some way. The other question, what was the other question? Emily was going to ask it. She, she didn't know she was going to ask it.
Well, in the earlier session, you mentioned that we live in a time where people don't read, but you thought that nonfiction writers had the advantage over fiction writers.
Yes.
Would you mind expanding on that?
Well, for one thing, I think I'm going to tell you a story. When I was working for the NewsHour, I used to write through these essays, 3 minutes long, and people remembered them. This is one of the things that give me confidence about the world. People are hungry out there. They are hungry for something more than tweets. But they don't know how to say that, and they don't know where to look for you. They don't know how to look for your talent. They think they can't read what you're writing. And maybe you're writing poems that they can't read also. But I was at O'Hare Airport, and a woman I was looking for a plane to Grand Rapids. Where in the hell is the plane to Grand Rapids? And I was running late, and a woman calls out to me. And in those years, they usually got the initials right, or they got some of it right. Like it was Richard Ramirez, who is incidentally the name of a mass murderer in California. Can I say to you sometime about nonfiction? Richard Ramirez has received more love letters. He strangled women alongside the freeways. And he got married while he was in prison. And someday I would like a woman writer to take him on and to write about the romance with the murderer in prison. But she said, Mr. Ramirez, she said, you know, I've never forgotten the piece you did on AIDS. And she repeated to me the way the way the piece worked, the way it worked through time. I didn't know people listened to television. I didn't know that. I thought they sort of just walked by a television or sort of glanced at it. I didn't know that they listened to it. She remembered the way the piece worked. That was her doing, not mine. There are people out there so desperate for what you can provide them that they will take it if you can find them. And you have to look for them. But in many ways, I think nonfiction finds them more easily because some of them still might read a magazine. Some of them still might read the newspaper. Some of them still might know something about the Ebola scare in America. A writer would have some capacity. Writers should not sound like a dentist. They shouldn't sound like anyone else. That when writers speak, it should be something so surprising. So that when Richard Rodriguez has a piece on the wall between the United States and Mexico, he would have something to say that you don't expect to read. It's quite new, it's quite different. That's what a writer brings. And they're willing to listen to it, even though people will write back in 2 sentences. This guy's a leftist, or this guy doesn't know what's going on in the border and so forth. But you give them something about the world that they're inhabiting, and they recognize it more easily than if I were to write a short story about the border. For me, I have found I can get something published in the New York Times, the LA Times, because people will find it. I can do a documentary on the border for the BBC. This is as a writer, and people will know that it is written. They will hear it. They'll say, this script is written. I can hear it, and they will remember it back to me. I'm not telling you to give up fiction. I'm not telling you to give up poetry. I am telling you that the remarkable thing about the writing program in this university is that it acknowledges nonfiction as part of the literary arts. In many places that I go to, I was at Riverside last week, and the students proudly gave me their literary magazine, and there were only poems and short stories. And I said, where are your essays? I think of so many of the writers whose lives changed mine. My own Sacramento writer, Joan Didion. Her essays, I think, are better than her novels, much better than her novels. But that's not fair to her. I think what she did in writing the essays is that she took a novelistic sense of narrative, of time, and gave it to her essays. So you don't have to choose. You can feed one glass of water into the other. I think a poet can make. Auden, the greatest poet of his generation, wrote some of the greatest essays of his generation. You don't have to live in a straitjacket. If you are a poet and you hear a word like Hispanic, you hear a word like gay, play with it. Know that the language is in flux, and it is your business to comment on it. Your subject is language, what it can say, what it will never say, and the necessity of silence. And here comes mine. Thank you.